Big news everyone, there's a new Scott Pilgrim anime out and I think it's pretty great. But is it anime? Well, my anime list, or MAL, doesn't think so quite. The biggest database for Japanese anime on the web. But who gets to decide what is and isn't anime? Has there ever been a group of people who've thought about these sort of distinctions before, ever? No, not possible. Well, MAL certainly has, and they have a little list that they put together which we're going to be looking through today. And when it comes to the question of who is a plush, it's me. See this plush? Limited time offer, 25th of December, get them now. So I don't have to cry because it failed to sell and then I have to refund everyone. Cool? Cool. Mwah. So first things first, you may hear all the time, in Japan they just call everything anime. Anime just means animation. Everything's all the same. It doesn't matter. They don't make distinction in Japan. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, I can tell you that much. In fact, there's a great video by Cynic Clinic on the whole history of the term anime that you should totally watch. To make a long story short, technically the first word for animation in Japan was doga, but over the years anime has slowly succeeded it and taken over, to the point that doga does not mean animation anymore. Kizaboru Sugi, who worked on Astro Boy, said its founder Tezuka told him that he believes that the word was coined by Tezuka to describe his new limited approach to TV animation. And people within the industry tend to look at anime as a term like this. But it's also not the only term in Japan for animation. If we do this right, it will be an animation rather than a manga movie. Manga eiga, or manga film, comes from the term manga, originally meaning cartoon. See, these words, they change their meaning all the time. But also, when he uses the term animation here, he means it in terms of the pedigree of international animation. Miyazaki doesn't think too highly of the term anime and its niche audience or its limited animation potential, even at times calling it the equivalent of airline fast food when he's being a specifically diva. Yoshiyuki Tomino has also veered away from the term, as we can see in some of his anime in the past. So let's have a look at a MAL's list and try and find some common ground here. It needs to be animated. Okay, Scott Pilgrim, definitely animated. Next thing, needs to be made by people in the Japanese anime industry. Okay, yeah, I can see a lot of people in that industry on the list there. I mean, Science Arrow, Japanese anime studio. I think that's pretty simple. Next, needs to be for the Japanese market. Okay, that's where things might get a bit blurry in terms of definitions and the way we look at this. A point made in the opening of the book, Anime's Identity, is even when something is made for Japan, because of streaming or simulcast, it may be received first internationally and more conveniently abroad. In some instances, like Lupin the Third Part 4, that premiered in Italy over a month before its Japanese release. What about Sonic X? Its final season was made for international audiences, and it never received a Japanese physical release. And it didn't even get a Japanese broadcast until over a decade later. I mean, all that stuff's on MAL, so it's whatever, don't worry about it. International licenses now make more money domestically than merchandise. In fact, international audiences make more money for the anime industry than sometimes domestic do. So at this point, things are changing quite a lot, if the anime industry report can be believed, that is. Hell, even the international streaming rights for companies like Crunchyroll basically reimburse an anime's entire budget instantly. As big streaming companies all over the world spend more money making and acquiring anime for their service, terms like the Japanese market will mean less and less. And this isn't even the first time something like this has happened. Back in the 2000s, Gonzo took advantage of its international audience and started catering to them, and when that DVD boom completely collapsed, so did their whole entire business. So where is the general line between these things? Well, we sometimes make a distinction between domestic animation, say for example in the anime industry, and international outsourcing for an American cartoon or something. Say for example, Batman the Animated Series, that has a ton of Japanese anime studios working on it all over, including Telecom via TMS. That company basically animated a ton of the afternoon block of American cartoons. You can see in Batman's credits that the director, the storyboards, and the animation checkers tend to be American, and they're the ones overlooking the Japanese work. But a little bit later on things get complicated because those studios like TMS are allowed to start directing and storyboarding and checking their own animation, so the lines blur ever further. However, the team at Warner did not want it to look like Japanese animation, so there was a line in the sand. What are the differences between American and Japanese cartoons? Well, in this instance, we have full animation, When it comes to American cartoons, they are animated on 1s and 2s, which means there's a new drawing for every frame, or they double that up and then there are 12 frames for every second. On top of that, you might see things like the storyboard is king. There's very little wiggle room when it comes to that. You do exactly what's on there. When it's locked in, that's done. Creativity, not for the Japanese team. Next may be that it's made in batches. So until every episode is done in a batch, it does not air. Where in the Japanese industry, you could be working on the production a couple of hours before it is syndicated on television. Those deadlines are much tighter. One of the biggest changes is going to be lip syncing, which you actually need to do in American cartoons. And Atsuko Tanaka has some insight onto that process right here.
For the American side, they're very much into how the lips move in the animation. So I didn't know how much effort Americans put into that aspect. Maybe you already know, but Japan is the total opposite. You draw, and then the voice actors have to move around with it.
So for Scott Pilgrim, the English voice acting was done first and then was used as reference for the animation. That's quite rare in this industry. It doesn't happen very often, especially with an English cast. When you look at the Japanese and English together, it takes a little moment, but you can tell the English one is more synced.
I am 16 kinds of pumped to see Sex Bomb tonight. That's how it goes. I feel so excited I might actually pass out.
However, this is not to say this has never happened in Japanese animation history. Usually TV anime avoid the process entirely because it takes too much time and that deadline's already tight. When you look at something like Karikano, which has a loose lip sync, it took a tight schedule and turned it into something that collapsed and burned upon itself. What about Akira? Well, that movie had lip sync completely, although it's not exactly the same as how an American company would lip sync. You can find out more in this other Cynic Clinic video about anime lip sync. It's great. While Scott Pilgrim is lip synced, it still uses the techniques and performance of an anime mouth flap, which has about 3 frames, instead of the more robust English lip syncing. Now, why did it do that? Maybe that makes it easier for them to sync the Japanese cast at the same time, I don't know. But really, when it comes to differences between American and Japanese animation, it goes far further than just mouth flaps. Ex-Disney animator Peter Chung talks about his perspective on the difference between East and West animation. He says that American animation kind of has a philosophy closer to Western fine art painting, that it bases itself on the strict adherence of realism, rendering the artist invisible in order to elevate the project. Where he sees Japanese approach as stylized, impressionistic, and concerned entirely on the brushstroke, focused on capturing the character expression in the end.
One reason why many artists, including myself at one time, are attracted to Japanese animation and may be inspired to emulate it is that you can see how it is done. You can easily see it is composed of individual drawings, and for that reason, it seems within one's reach.
I gotta say, I kind of also engage with the concept of how anime is produced there. That limited approach gives you a lot of leeway, but also stylistic variety. And limited animation is foundational to the approach of what created Japanese anime. If we went through a list, we'd have to start with that, because back in the 80s, when it came to TV anime, a lot of studios were putting caps on the amount of drawings you could do per episode. In Toei, that involved 3,500 drawings. In the last 40 years, it hasn't really changed that much. It's still roughly around that number, which is not really a lot of drawings when you think about it. So they had to find other ways of working with that, if that would be still images. You've got close-ups of crowds. It's all about the reaction shot. Maybe you can take that reaction shot and paint it to get the extra effect. Maybe you can add a special effects layer for rain and wind to really make the emotions fly, change the colors. Of course, you could also think about looping animation. If you're going to draw a certain amount of frames, you might as well get the most out of them by looping them and flipping them. There's also Animation Bank. You've got to store your detailed animation so you don't have to redo it. You can reuse it if that be a crazy finisher or a transformation sequence. Do it once nice and you can use it forever. What about pull cells? I guess you could also call it gekimation, where you simply pull an object, a character or a cell across the screen. 1 frame's all you need. You don't need to throw any extras in there, especially when you do it quick. And of course, we've talked about lip syncing before, but it's not the priority. What might be more of a priority is things like the camera movement. You can pull in to get that emotional experience, but not too much because we're talking about the anime industry. We don't have these giant multi-plane cameras like they do at Disney. We might have a much smaller version of that. So a lot of the times we are using something called animatism. It's all about how each of the cells slides next to each other. Lots of sliding. It's all horizontal for the most part through its history. There's lots of sliding, small zooms, and directional changes when it comes to things like blur or adding post-processing on the top. Although nowadays with the power of CG it's a lot easier to do deep zooms than it used to be because we have these virtual cameras, so that has opened up quite a lot for modern anime. Anime mixes all this and stylistic shorthand together to make something better than the sum of its parts, and also something that all exists in the same world. When I asked David and Cenas if it was difficult to work between all these different anime movies in the 90s as an in-betweener, he said not really because all the studios had the same pipeline. So when they needed a little help between each other, they passed it around and it all effectively worked in the same way. He wasn't worried no matter how stylistically different it looked, it all came together in the same way. Okay, so it looks like an anime, it seems like it's in that sort of framework, but do they have autonomy? Is Science Zero actually doing what they want to? Or is Brian O'Malley and Netflix just cracking the whip, telling them exactly what to do? I mean, he was the creator of the original comic, so maybe he is quite controlling in that. I guess we should ask him himself.
Well, I mean, yeah, using reference was the big one. I mean, on this, I didn't have to do any really visual heavy lifting, like Science Zero took care of everything.
Oh, okay, never mind. It looks like it's all them. Oh my lord, it's getting hot. How PLUSHHH? Kind of hot today, isn't it? Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. It's me, STEVEM, of the channel STEVEM, here to tell you about my Give Me Swag plush and me being really ill. And I couldn't finish this video as fast as I'd like to because of that, when everyone else was talking about it a couple of weeks ago, that is. But hopefully this topic isn't going away anytime soon, and the video works for what it needs to be. So yeah, that's cool. And I want to show some appreciation to the community this holiday season. Thank you very much, everyone who supports the channel, including my patrons, such as Lenny, Tim James Richards, Joven, Down Straight, Asker Rao, Stratogen, Stratos, Chunks, Jay, Foxmod, Oti, Paul, Steven's Mom, Subsofa, Takayuki Suzuki, Systematic, Karen, Nick, Doji, Peter, Agor, and Vic Boss. Thanks, everyone. And hopefully plenty more coming in the following year. Maybe in the season 2. We'll see. We'll see. The plans are happening at some point. Anyway, hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Well, I guess there's one more area that relates to anime that I have discussed. The media mix, the franchising. Steinberg said that is definitely one of the biggest parts of how anime is made. It is organised around its distribution, if that be TV, DVD, movie, etc., etc. And it's character-centric and inherently transmedia. Modern anime are made in production committees, so lots of different companies come together and put a little bit of funding into a pot to fund the entire thing. And that gives them safety, but maybe not exactly the return the anime studio would like if it was really successful. When it comes to the idea of media mix, it's basically a form of franchising where the anime or whatever is like an ecosphere. It exists within this different world of lots of different things where the characters are really the main focal point. The stories don't even need to necessarily connect, although they could be very difficult to understand if you don't know the original source material. In fact, Scott Pilgrim kind of relates to this media mix strategy because the soundtrack is from Anna Managuchi, who did the video game soundtrack for Scott Pilgrim. And then you look at the movie cast returns for the anime version. And then when you look at the actual scripting for the original comic author, it makes all these meta references to things like Scott Pilgrim being turned into a movie, or in fact even commentary on the original source material itself. All that stuff wouldn't exactly be as well understood by people coming in fresh, and is probably more gratifying for long-time fans. But it's definitely not an exaggeration to say that this version of the show in its current form could not exist without every other piece of the media in that media mix of Scott Pilgrim. Hell, I even joked once that this felt like Scott Pilgrim Rebuild 1.0, but then I saw that the actual author made a similar comparison when he was talking about the show at his TIFF conference. To be fair, the Rebuild films don't use a production committee and they have a different way of funding, but I suppose there are other anime that have different ways of funding too. It doesn't have to be that way. Let's have a look at Animatrix. How was that funded? Well, it was that big Warner cash dump when the Matrix was absolutely at the height of things. The Wachowskis got together all their favourite anime creators and said, go wild in the Animatrix universe. Well, that's definitely a co-production. That's definitely not necessarily made for Japan. But it's still on Mal, I guess. Which is interesting because also one of those shorts was made in Korea entirely and has nothing to do with the Japanese anime industry. Well, that gets on to the idea that anime itself is inherently transnational and physically could not be made without support from all these other countries. And that's been that way for quite a long time. The anime industry itself would not exist without international freelancers. And hell, the director of Scott Pilgrim is even Spanish. But you look at Madhouse, they have basically one pipeline which is mostly just Korean animated. Even this season's Free Ren has episodes which were predominantly handled in Korea, from animation, cleanup, backgrounds and in-betweens. It's not like Madhouse is particularly hiding it. They've been very open about this, even with Madhouse producers saying they're not exactly worried about the nationality of their animators, they're only worried about good animation. But this does create a bit of a Ship of Theseus situation where it's like, how much percentage-wise does it need to be the Japanese team for it to be considered part of the Japanese industry? Or does it really matter if it's just like 3 people, one being the director or an animation director or something? I guess we'd let the Americans get away with that and still calling their cartoons American. Well, that gets back to the topic of soft power in anime. Okay, so what is soft power? Well, hard power is about military might to force and manipulate people to do what you want. Soft power is more about the influence your culture, values, and exports have around the world and how they can influence political relationships that way. But I suppose there's a little bit of an uncomfortable situation here where, like, the extended arms of the anime industry are basically all old colonial states which they used their old hard power to take over. And now they do animation work for them. In fact, some of them, even during the occupation, like with South Korea, they supported them on in-betweens for war propaganda cartoons. And these people do make up a large percentage of the pipeline. 70% of Toei's animation output comes from the Philippines, even if you wouldn't really know that offhand. I think an interesting comparison to all this is a Korean cartoon often called anime, Legend of Korra. You see, during its second season, Nickelodeon actually tried to get Japanese animators on board to sort of take more advantage of that sort of anime trending name. But it didn't go as well as they hoped it would.
단점? 단점이라 해야 되나? 아니면 좀 약점이 있는데 그게 뭐냐면 자기네 건 잘하는데 남의 건 못해요. 그러니까 자기네 일본만의 애니메이션은 진짜 기가 막히게 만들거든요. 근데 다른 나라랑 같이 무엇인가 협업을 하라고 하면 못해요. 우리나라 같은 경우는 이제 어떤 나라의 문화를 갖다가 받아들여도 그 문화를
It was Pero who was outsourced for season 2, but they were so used to the anime pipeline they couldn't really get on with that American pipeline. Studio Mir, who did season 1, received a call from Nickelodeon, pretty much saying, please come on and be the head of season 2. They assumed after they had already rejected it that that meant that things were going really badly with Pero. And they had to take a sort of gamble here where they thought about, if the animation looks bad, they're the ones who are probably going to get blamed by their business partners, who will assume that they did it. So in the end, even though they were burnt out after season 1, they ended up having to do half of season 2 to make sure it wasn't a complete failure. Animation-wise, I could see that there might be some bitterness there because Korean animators are taught to draw like others and perform like other cultures when they animate. They have to learn to blend in. And for the general audience, the only time they tend to bring up outsourcing is when they dictate it to look bad and want to blame them for it. The rest of the time they are completely invisible, sometimes even literally, and it's been claimed by certain Japanese sources that during the 80s, Korean animators were given fake Japanese names in the credits opposed to let people know anyone but Japanese people made this. At the end of the 90s, anime had gained even more international popularity and the government had started to take notice. And it became part of their Cool Japan project, which was to push their soft power ever further into the globe. Now, while it was a complete failure in that regard, I do believe people, unconsciously or not, think of anime as intrinsically Japanese. But by doing that, it kind of ignores all those invisible organs of the industry that are needed to make it work. But I don't want to go the other side where Netflix will slap the term anime on anything they want to sell to you, especially if it's for a specific audience. They don't care where it's from, what it does. It's all anime to them because it's all a commodity. Now, I do think there's still utility to the term anime. I think it would be quite useful. And that's why I disagree with Jeff Fu in terms of his perspective on Mother's Basement about the term anime, which he calls a relic, and he thinks that it is blurring the lines and makes it more difficult because it's all animation. Well, I think from a historical perspective, from a production perspective, even from a media and how it is sold perspective, there's still utility there. I mean, it does exist. The anime industry is real, and there is like a production report every year in terms of how well it's doing and what the trends are, etc. Like, these things are literally in front of us. When it comes to Scott Pilgrim, if it's anime or not, I mean, sure, why not? Like, it doesn't change anything if it's an anime or not, it's still a great show. After all, anime is an art, not a science, and you're going to have a hard time making everyone agree with one definition of the thing. I mean, the situation in the industry is constantly changing and evolving, and so does the definition then. Especially if those new tax laws happen in Japan, which may completely destroy the freelancing in the Japanese industry, which is most of its animators. That would be a big problem. It will only speed up the sort of transnational approach and outsourcing because the demand is still there. Scott Pilgrim may be the first, but it probably won't be the last when it comes to this conversation. And while we're at it, why don't we sort of add more categories on these websites? I mean, I don't like it that all of East Asian animation is basically just thrown in the back and just sort of put over the title of anime. Can we get like a Donghua section or something? Or at very least, can we also get a section for co-productions? Because I think there's an interesting history that should be sort of easier to locate than there is right now. I'd say definitely Scott Pilgrim would be considered a co-production, and I think the director has a good summary of what he was going for in the project right here.
So I think the style is very special because it's based on the comic, but still has the touch of anime and the Japanese designer. So I think it's a very beautiful mix of both.
But you know, mouse sucks anyway, so why don't we use like a better website? Like IMDb or something, huh? I'll see you next time. Me and Little Me, very cool, very cool. Thumbs up.